The thermometer outside Mike Anderson's cabin showed 40 degrees below zero, and the temperatures kept dropping. Since moving to this remote corner of Alaska 5 years ago, he had never experienced such an extreme winter. The approaching storm system was more than just a challenge. It promised to push even the toughest wilderness dwellers to their limits. Mike lived deep in the heart of Alaska, where the nearest town was 4 hours away. His simple cabin stood lonely against the unforgiving landscape, its weathered wooden planks a testament to countless storms. On this February evening, as the wind howled through the tall pine trees, Mike felt that the decision to live here was being severely tested. The morning had begun quietly with the familiar crackling of the fireplace and the fading embers that barely dispelled the cold from the corners of his living room. Through the frost-covered windows, he could no longer ignore the fresh chill. Mike was 45 years old and an experienced nature photographer. After leaving behind his busy life in Seattle, he had focused on this life of solitude. His routine was strict because, in this wilderness, a small mistake could quickly be deadly. He checked his weather radio, secured the generator, and checked the supplies. Everything was handled with the care of a man who had learned the hard way in nature. He knew that carelessness was not forgiven in this environment. However, this morning brought particularly alarming news. A storm system from the north promised record lows and winds strong enough to break trees. The afternoon brought the first wave of the storm. Snow fell in thick curtains, and visibility decreased to only a few meters. Mike spent the day securing his equipment, storing water, and checking his emergency supplies. He was on alert because he had learned to read nature's subtle signs: the silence of birds before a storm, the change in air pressure, and the special quality of silence that always preceded catastrophe. As evening approached, the storm intensified. The wind found every tiny gap in the walls of the cabin, producing an eerie whistling that Mike never quite got used to. He prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, knowing full well that he needed to conserve his supplies in case the storm kept him stuck indoors for longer. But then, something changed. Shortly after midnight, as the wind continued to rage, Mike heard a strange noise. It was deep, guttural, and barely audible over the storm, but it was enough to startle him. He reached for his flashlight and peered through the frosty window. The beam of light cut through the swirling snow, but visibility was poor. The temperature gauge showed -45 degrees, and the wind chill made it even colder. Then he saw them. 3 dark figures moving laboriously through the white nothingness. A bear mother with 2 cubs. Their movements were slow and uncertain, and even from a distance, Mike could see they were struggling. The otherwise strong bear mother looked exhausted, her cubs huddled close to her. The snow was already forming thick ice crusts on her fur. Mike's heart raced. Bears were supposed to be in deep hibernation at this time of year. That these animals were active under such extreme conditions could only mean something had gone terribly wrong. Probably their den had been destroyed, and now they were desperately seeking shelter. They were fighting for their lives, and they were coming closer. Mike knew this was a highly dangerous situation. Every rule in the wilderness warned against getting too close to bears, especially when they were this desperate. But he couldn't take his eyes off the bear family. Their movements were slowing, and the cubs began to stagger. The cold was taking its toll. In the freezing cold of that night, Mike stood before a decision that would not only challenge his survival skills, but also test the core of his humanity. The wind continued to howl through the night as Mike stood in front of the frost-covered window of his cabin. Outside, the 3 bears fought for survival. The mother bear had positioned herself closely next to her cubs, pressing them against her in an attempt to protect them from the merciless cold. However, the signs of her exhaustion were unmistakable. Her movements had become slower, and her powerful appearance now seemed broken. The cubs, much too small and weak for such extreme conditions, trembled uncontrollably and kept sinking into the snow. Mike's breath fogged up the glass as he watched the scene. Everything he knew about life in the wilderness told him to stay inside. Wild animals, especially bears, were unpredictable, especially when desperate. But another thought drilled into his mind. What was the point of all his preparation, all his rules, if he just watched these creatures die at his door? He remembered his father's warning. Nature does not forgive negligence, Mike, but it also rewards courage. Was it courage to save the bears, or was it stupidity? This question had no clear answer. Still, Mike couldn't shake the image of the mother bear protecting her young. Her eyes, filled with despair and resignation, had burned themselves into his memory. Mike tore himself away from the cold window. He turned toward his small storage room, a separate structure next to the cabin. He had originally built it to protect his photo equipment and supplies from moisture. The space was insulated and heated. Maybe it could serve as a safe place for the bears. But how could he get them there? And what if the mother panicked? She could destroy everything, even kill him. Nevertheless, he began making preparations. His movements were mechanical, as though an invisible will was guiding him. He set up heaters in the storage room and placed thick blankets near the door. Then he set dry food out. His heart was pounding as he carefully thought through every step. He knew that the success of his plan depended on getting the bears into the warm room as quickly as possible. At the window again, Mike watched the bear mother weakly try to lift one of her cubs. The little one hardly moved, its body almost completely buried in the snow. It was a sight that shook Mike to the core. Without thinking further, he donned his thickest coat, grabbed several blankets, and opened the door. A freezing gust of wind hit him, robbing him of his breath and making it difficult to move. The bears were just a few meters away from his porch. Their massive bodies barely rose and fell, and the mother bear lifted her head slightly and looked at him. Her eyes were glassy but alert, as if she understood that he was her last hope. Slowly and carefully, Mike moved forward. "It's all right," he whispered, more to himself than to the bears. With trembling hands, he spread a blanket over the cubs. The mother bear tensed, but remained silent. Mike knew she had little strength left to react. He placed another blanket over her before slowly withdrawing. Back at the cabin, he observed as the mother bear slowly lifted one of her cubs and pushed toward the storage room door. Her instinctive protective drive was stronger than her exhaustion. Mike held his breath as she took one slow step after another. The path to the door was short, but in the chilling cold, it felt endless. Finally, she reached it. With the last of her strength, she pulled her cubs inside, determination in every movement. Mike watched with bated breath as she curled up with them in the warm room. She pulled the blankets protectively over her young, and then met his eyes for the last time before lowering her head. Mike closed the door to the storage room and slumped against the wall. The storm raged on, but for a brief moment he felt peace. He had defied every rule he had ever learned, but the bears had survived, at least for this night. The hours after the rescue felt the longest Mike had ever experienced. The storm kept shaking the cabin's walls as if testing his decision. But inside the storage room, there was a deceptive calm. From the cabin, Mike watched through the small window as the mother bear tended to her cubs, warming them. The small bodies hardly moved, but the gentle rise and fall of their chests was a sign of life. The bear mother never took her eyes off Mike. Even now, as she protected her young, her eyes remained half open, as if watching him, waiting for his next move. There was no aggression in her gaze anymore, just something that bordered on trust. Mike knew he had to be cautious. Any sudden movement could disrupt the fragile balance between wilderness and human. Time passed slowly. Mike prepared water and food without entering the storage room. He knew it was wiser to stay away and not interfere. Instead, he placed the containers near the door and withdrew. When the bears slept, the mother carefully took the food he had provided, always waiting until Mike had removed himself. During the hours of darkness, Mike thought about the events. He remembered the photographs of bears that adorned his walls. These images had captured sublime moments, the wild and free nature of the animals. But now, he had become part of their story. No photo could capture this connection. It had deeply moved him and made him question his own role in nature. On the morning of the second day, the storm showed no signs of abating. The snow was deep, and the world was a monochrome chaos. Mike checked the weather forecast with his radio. The storm would last at least another 24 hours. He took a deep breath and prepared himself to continue. In the storage room, the cubs were showing the first signs of improvement. Their movements became livelier, and they seemed warmer. The mother nudged them gently, encouraging them to move. A breath of hope hung in the air, but with hope came worry. Mike knew that the bears couldn't stay near his cabin for too long. If they became too accustomed to humans, it could be their death sentence. In the wild, any dependence on humans could be dangerous, but it was too early to worry about that. The bears needed more time. That night, a turning point came. Mike was awakened by faint scratching at the storage room door. When he looked out cautiously, he saw the mother bear pacing restlessly back and forth. Her instinct to leave the safety of the hut and return to the wilderness seemed to overwhelm her. Mike knew this moment was inevitable. He opened the door carefully but remained in a safe position. The cold night air crept in, but the mother remained calm. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between